Welcome back, everyone, to Dr. Scary Tales. Tonight I have something special for you. A story that will slowly creep under your skin. The kind that haunts the edges of your mind when you're alone. But first, let me ask you, have you ever walked into a library where silence almost feels alive? You'll want to grab your headphones for this one. I promise you, every whisper, every creak will come alive in ways that might make you wish you weren't listening alone. If you're brave enough, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that will keep you up at night. And now, let's begin. It started in a place we often think of as quiet, peaceful, safe. I've always found a certain comfort in libraries. The rows upon rows of books, the hushed reverence for knowledge, the way even time seems to slow down inside their walls. So when I needed a break from the chaos of my life, I signed up to volunteer at the Old Town Library. It was an escape, a retreat into solitude where I could spend hours hidden away from the world. But there was something about this particular library, the kind of place that feels too still, too silent. You know that feeling, right? That unease when you're alone, and yet you can't shake the sense that you're being watched. The library was a relic of the 1800s, a massive building that had survived decades of renovations but never quite shook off its age. Even in the middle of the day, shadows clung to the corners of the high ceiling, and the scent of musty, decaying pages lingered in the air. As soon as I stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the world outside fell away, leaving me in a vacuum of quiet. It wasn't long before I started volunteering for the late shifts, when the library was practically deserted, just me, and sometimes an elderly librarian who would disappear into the back offices by 9. It was during those hours, after the lights dimmed and the silence deepened, that things began to feel off. At first, it was subtle. The sound of wind rattling the old windows, the occasional distant clatter, that I convinced myself came from the heating system. But then I started noticing more. There were whispers, not loud or aggressive, but soft, like the faintest murmur of voices exchanging secrets just out of earshot. They would rise from the empty stacks, behind shelves filled with forgotten books, only to vanish the moment I focused in on them. I would stop mid-shelving, listening, trying to make sense of the noise, but it was always gone as quickly as it had come. Have you ever heard something so faint you weren't sure if it was real, or maybe you convinced yourself it wasn't? What would you do? The oddities didn't stop there. Sometimes, when I entered the library's main reading room, I would see a chair pulled out, as if someone had just stood up, though the building was supposed to be empty. Books I hadn't touched would be placed on the tables, open to random pages, words highlighted or underlined in neat, careful script. One night, while I was reshelving some old volumes in the basement, I caught sight of something or someone in my peripheral vision, a figure, standing still, cloaked in the dim light filtering down from the grates above. I spun around, my heart slamming in my chest, only to find nothing, just rows of books, some gathering dust, others clearly disturbed from their place and as though they had been moved recently. But the worst of it came when the lights flickered. It was past 10, the library officially closed, and I was finishing up when the flicker started. At first, it was just a soft buzz, the lights dimming and brightening as though the wiring had aged like everything else in the building. But then it grew more erratic, almost rhythmic, as though it pulsed in time with something unseen. I tried to stay calm, I'd experienced faulty lights before, but this felt deliberate. I could hear the steady thud-thud of my heartbeat in my ears as I stood beneath the flickering light, gripping the cart handle so tight my knuckles turned white. And then the light in the far corner went out completely, plunging part of the room into darkness. The air felt different, heavier, thicker. Do you feel that tension building? I want you to imagine that scene, the darkness closing in while you're standing there, waiting for something to happen. What would you do? Would you leave, or would you stay to investigate? I took a step forward, peering into the shadows. But before I could get far, a sound echoed from deep within the stacks. It was faint, but unmistakable. A slow, deliberate scraping, like someone dragging their fingers along the shelves. It stopped as soon as I moved closer, but I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I backed away, my skin prickling, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But then, as I turned to go, I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The unmistakable sound of breathing, not mine, not shallow or panicked. This breathing was calm, measured, and coming from just behind the nearest shelf. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My legs locked in place and my pulse racing. And for the first time, I understood what real terror felt like. It wasn't the noise or the flickering lights. It was the certainty that I was not alone. I bolted. I ran through the darkened halls, and my footsteps echoing against the cold stone floor, the distant lights flickering as though they were reacting to my fear. I didn't stop until I reached the front doors, throwing them open, gasping for air as I stumbled outside. The night was cold and still, and the silence felt deafening compared to the chaos I'd just left behind. I thought I was safe. But when I looked back at the library, something was wrong. In one of the top windows, a figure stood, watching, motionless, just standing there, as if waiting for me to come back inside. I never returned to that library after that night. I quit without explanation, and every time I pass by the building now, I get that same sinking feeling in my gut. It's been months, but the image of that figure haunts me. I still don't know who or what was in that library with me, and part of me is terrified to find out. Maybe I imagined it all. Maybe the old building was just playing tricks on me. But I don't think so. Do you? If you've ever had a brush with the paranormal, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me, what's the creepiest place you've ever been? And if this story left you with a chill, don't forget to hit like. Subscribe if you're brave enough to hear what comes next. Trust me, you won't want to listen alone. I never returned to that library after that night. But there are other places like it. Places that don't feel like they should exist in the same world as the one we live in. And this next story takes place in a library unlike any other. Not the grand towering one from before, but a smaller, more forgotten place. A relic from a time most people have long since abandoned to memory, if they even remember it at all. Have you ever heard of those ghost towns? You know, the ones that once thrived but now lie empty, crumbling under the weight of time. Most people think of sun-bleached shacks and old western saloons, but some places are different. This town was one of those places, and at the heart of it was a library that had been frozen in time. It wasn't large. In fact, it looked more like an old house, a narrow two-story structure with peeling paint and ivy that crawled up the walls like nature was trying to reclaim it. The windows were coated in a layer of grime so thick you could barely see inside. But there was something about it, something that drew me in. Maybe it was the stillness, the way the building seemed to stand untouched, as if the world had moved on but left this one place behind. Or maybe it was the strange sense of familiarity, as though I'd been there before, even though I was sure I hadn't. The locals, what few of them remained, didn't talk about it. When I asked for directions, they glanced at each other and then back at me with an odd mix of hesitation and fear. They told me the library was still standing, but no one had been inside for years. Not since the incident, one man muttered before quickly walking away. I should have left it alone, but I didn't. I suppose I was looking for an escape. My life had unraveled in ways I couldn't have anticipated. A broken relationship, a job I'd walked out on, and the nagging feeling that I was somehow adrift. Maybe that's why I agreed to look into the old library. I'd been writing an article about forgotten places, and this seemed like the perfect chance to immerse myself in something that felt as lost as I did. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was overcast, a dull gray that made the air feel heavy, like the clouds were pressing down on the town. The streets were empty, as if the few people left had retreated indoors, leaving the town to its ghosts. The library stood at the end of a narrow street, its faded sign swaying slightly in the breeze. Elmwood Library, established 1902. I hesitated on the threshold, key in hand. The town council had given it to me, warning that they hadn't set foot inside since before I was born. I tried to laugh it off, but my fingers shook as I turned the key. The door opened with a groan, revealing a long, dark hallway lined with shelves. The scent of dust and old paper hit me like a wall, but there was something else beneath it, something sour. I stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind me with a dull thunk. The sound echoed through the empty rooms, and I suddenly felt very alone. The library was in better shape than I'd expected. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, but the shelves were full, lined with books that looked untouched. It was like stepping into a time capsule, everything perfectly preserved, waiting for someone to come back and pick up where they left off. But as I walked deeper into the library, that familiar feeling of unease crept in. It started small, just a sense that I wasn't supposed to be there. The air felt too thick, too still, like the building was holding its breath, waiting for something. Every sound I made, my footsteps, the rustle of my jacket seemed too loud, as if the library itself was amplifying them. And then I heard it, a soft, barely audible click. It came from the back of the room and near the stairwell that led to the second floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was probably just the building settling. Old places make noise, right? But there was something about that sound, something too precise, too deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was upstairs, moving around. I thought about leaving right then, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I moved toward the stairs. The second floor was worse. The air felt even heavier, and the light filtering through the grime-covered windows was dim and sickly, casting long shadows across the floor. The books up here were older, their spines cracked and their pages yellowed with age. As I walked past them, I swear I could feel eyes on me, as if the library itself was watching. I tried to focus on the task at hand, documenting the place, taking notes, but my mind kept wandering. There was a presence. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, lingering just at the edges of my vision. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there. But I knew I wasn't alone. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure, standing at the far end of the room. It was barely visible in the dim light, just a dark silhouette, but I could tell it was watching me. Have you ever felt someone watching you? That unsettling feeling that there's someone behind you, even when you know there shouldn't be. What would you do? I called out, my voice trembling slightly, "Hello?" No response. I took a step closer, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Every instinct was telling me to turn around, to leave it, but I couldn't. I had to know what it was. I took another step, and then it was gone. It just gone. Like it had never been there in the first place. I don't know why I stayed after that, but something kept me there. I was drawn to the back of the library, where the figure had been standing. There was a door there, one I hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost hidden between two shelves and covered in dust, as if it hadn't been opened in years. But when I touched the handle, it was warm. I opened it. Inside was a small room, barely big enough for a desk and a single chair. On the desk was a stack of papers, letters, by the looks of them, and an old leather-bound journal. I picked it up, and my hands trembling, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. It told the story of the library, but not the version anyone knew. According to the journal, this place wasn't just a library. It had once been a place of something darker, something that had drawn people in, only to keep them here. Forever. As I read, the air around me grew colder, the shadows lengthening until the room was nearly pitch black. And then I heard it again, the click, and I wasn't alone. The sound was closer now, just outside the door. I slammed the journal shut and backed away, my heart racing. The presence was stronger here, almost suffocating. And then the door creaked open. I never saw what was on the other side. All I knew was that I had to get out. I ran down the stairs, through the main hall and out the front door, and not stopping until I was back in my car, gasping for breath. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that I left something behind. Or maybe something followed me out. I haven't been back to that town since. But if you ever find yourself in a forgotten place with a library that no one talks about, maybe think twice before going inside. Have you ever felt something was wrong, and even when you couldn't explain it to you? If you've experienced something like this, share your story in the comments. I want to know what happened to you. Thanks for sticking with me through these stories. I've got even more chilling tales coming up, so if you're ready for more, stay tuned. And remember, sometimes the scariest places are the ones we can't leave behind. I thought that would be the last of my strange encounters with libraries, but I was wrong. My next experience happened almost by accident, though now I wonder if it was inevitable. There's something about libraries that pulls me in, even the ones that aren't in plain sight. This time, it wasn't a public library or an abandoned town relic. It was a hidden reading room, tucked away in the depths of an old estate, the Gargrave Manor, the kind of place that, at first glance, seemed like just another forgotten historical site, buried in the rolling countryside of the English moors. The estate had been turned into a museum decades ago, but there were whispers, rumors about rooms that the public never saw, rooms where the past had a way of lingering. Gargrave Manor was one of those places with a history that felt heavy in the air. The guide, an older woman with tired eyes and a voice that felt distant, mentioned the library in passing, a private room once used by the estate's last heir, Reginald Gargrave, who had vanished mysteriously in the 1920s. His study had been sealed ever since. Most people dismissed it as part of the manor's folklore, but something about the story hooked into me. I don't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see that room. Maybe I thought it would give me some peace of mind, a way to prove to myself that all these haunted places were just stories, nothing more. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or haunted places, not really. But after what had happened at the library in the abandoned town, I'd started questioning everything. I needed answers. And this reading room, hidden away for nearly a century, seemed like the place to start. Gargrave Manor was the kind of place you could feel as soon as you crossed through the gates. The stone walls were thick with moss, the windows dark and impenetrable. It was a cold, grey afternoon when I arrived, the kind where the clouds seemed to sit just above the horizon, swallowing all light. The wind howled through the estate grounds, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic, something that made my skin crawl. I asked the guide about the hidden room again, pressing her for details. She was reluctant, her gaze darting nervously as though she was afraid to say too much. All she told me was that the room was locked, and no one had the key anymore. No one had seen the inside for decades, but I wasn't convinced. I had seen an old map of the estate in the museum's archives, and it showed a passage that led from the main gallery to a section of the manor that wasn't on the public tour. I knew where the room was, or at least I thought I did. It was nearing closing time when I made my move. The staff had all but vanished, leaving only the echo of footsteps in the grand hallways. I found the narrow staircase hidden behind an old tapestry and descended into the lower levels of the manor, my footsteps soft against the cold stone. The air grew colder as I moved deeper into the estate. The walls seemed to close in, the corridors tightening like the ribs of some ancient decaying creature. And then I saw it. The door, plain, wooden, and unassuming. Just a simple door at the end of a forgotten hallway. I stood there for a moment, just staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no keyhole, no lock, nothing to suggest why it had been sealed for all these years. I reached out, hand trembling, and pushed. To my surprise, the door swung open with ease. Inside the reading room, time standing still. The room inside was dark, except for a faint sliver of light creeping through the window's cracked shutters. Dust coated every surface, but the room was intact, untouched, as though Reginald Gargrave had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. The books lined the shelves, their spines faded and brittle. A massive oak desk stood in the center, covered in scattered papers, and an armchair draped in thick velvet faced the fireplace, as though waiting for someone to sit. The air was stifling, thick with a smell I couldn't quite place, something sweet, almost like decay masked by perfume. I hesitated, my instincts telling me to leave, but curiosity pulled me forward. There was something wrong with the room. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but then I realized it was too quiet. I couldn't hear the wind, the creaking of the old house, or even my own footsteps as they shuffled across the floor. It was like the room was suspended outside of time. I moved toward the desk, my fingers brushing the old leather-bound journal lying open on the surface. The pages were yellowed, filled with neat, flowing handwriting. Reginald Gargrave's handwriting. The words on the pages told a story, Reginald's story. He wrote about the room, how he had found it after his father's death, how it had been kept secret for generations. He wrote about the strange occurrences, how he would spend hours in the reading room, only to find that no time had passed outside its walls. Days would bleed into nights without him noticing, until he began to lose track of time altogether. But the entries became darker, more erratic. He spoke of hearing voices, whispers that called to him from the walls. He saw figures in the corner of his eye, always just out of sight. And then the last entry, scrawled hastily across the page. The room is a trap. It's a door that opens, but never lets you leave. If you find this, get out. It's too late for me. Don't make the same mistake. I dropped the journal, my blood running cold. The room suddenly felt wrong. The silence pressed in, suffocating it, and I could feel something watching me. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. Where it had once been, there was now just a blank wall. My heart pounded in my chest as I searched the room, frantic, but there was no way out. The whispers began, soft at first and then louder, until they filled the room with a low, eerie hum. I spun around, but no one was there. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, twisting into strange shapes, flickering in and out of sight. I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper, but there was no answer, just the relentless feeling that I was no longer alone. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I ran to the window, pulling at the shutters, desperate for air, for escape. But when I looked outside, it was night. The clouds were gone, replaced by a dark, starless sky. But the strangest part, I had only been in the room for a few minutes. It had been broad daylight when I entered. Time wasn't just strange in this room, it was broken. I pounded on the walls, shouting for help, but the only response was my own voice, echoing back at me in the suffocating silence. The room was closing in, smaller, darker, more suffocating with every passing moment. And then I saw it, the armchair facing the fireplace. Someone or something was sitting there now. The figure was still, shrouded in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I backed away slowly, but the room seemed to stretch, the walls bending and warping around me. My legs grew heavy, my vision dimming, as though the very air was draining the life from me. I don't know how long I've been in here now. Time doesn't move right in this place. I keep seeing the figure, sitting in the chair, but every time I blink, it gets closer. The door hasn't reappeared, and I don't think it ever will. I don't think it ever. If you've ever had an experience like this where time seemed to twist or something felt off, comment below and let everyone know your story. I'd love to hear it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more chilling tales just like this one. Stay tuned. There's much more to come, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's next.